Gentlemen, welcome to the Akademie für politische Bildung. Dear Mr. President, Dr. Erler, dear Dr. Brey, dear colleagues, dear guests. It's my honor and privilege to welcome you to the Akademie für politische Bildung. Also in the name of Dr. Quaiser from the Akademie, I welcome all of you. First, I would like to thank the presidency of the Südosteuropa-Gesellschaft for once again a very fruitful cooperation. Many thanks especially to the president of the association, Dr. Gernot Erler. We are very glad and grateful for your visit once again in Tutzing and for your welcome address right afterwards. I would also like to thank Dr. Christian Hagemann and Victoria Somogi for preparing and organizing this conference together with the Academy. Professor Dr. Christoph Neumann and Dr. Jutta Laut-Backers, they are responsible for the program of this conference. Thank you so much for your ideas and your elaboration of a really outstanding academic program. The Akademie für politische Bildung, the Academy for Civic Education, you could translate it, but you are not forced to do it. We appreciate this cooperation with the Südosteuropa-Gesellschaft very much. Due to the chosen subjects and due to your distinguished referees, your conferences in Tutzing enjoy a high reputation all over Europe. This is the 58th International University Week, and we are very glad to once again host it. Please allow me to make you familiar with our institution, with the Akademie für politische Bildung. The Academy is a unique, in Germany and probably in whole Europe, it's a unique forum for communication and information on current and general topics of both national as well as international political interests. The Akademie für politische Bildung is a meeting point where politicians and experts in science, research, and civic education gather with citizens to exchange their experience and opinions to the benefit of policies to be constructed more citizen-friendly. Since 1957 already, the Akademie für politische Bildung is dedicated to the delivery, stimulation, and cultivation of political knowledge, not only for Bavaria, but for whole Germany. We offer courses, and of course, also for some countries in Europe. We offer courses, seminars, and conferences on our own premises here in Tutzing, as well as outside in different locations all over Bavaria. Your conference is not only remarkable with regard to its high scientific reputation, but also with regard to its significance as a kind of network meeting for young as well as for experienced scholars working on Southeast Europe issues. The topic of your current conference, Borders in Southeast Europe, is obviously very well chosen. Already some years ago, one of my colleagues of the Universität der Bundeswehr, the University of the Federal Armed Forces in Germany, who is professor of international law, he drew my attention to one of the most, in my regard, one of the most precise terms on the subject of borders. And I would like to cite the German philosopher of Christian religion, Bernhard Welte, first in German and then in my own translation. I hope it corresponds well enough to the original quotation. So first, the German citation. And I quote, "Die Grenze waltet zwar auch als Negation, das heißt als Unterscheidung, aber wir müssen nun dem hinzufügen, als eine Unterscheidung, die überall zugleich vereint. Die Grenze, die die Bereiche trennt, ist auch das ihnen beiden Gemeinsame. Die Grenze waltet, indem sie zusammenhält, verknüpft und benachbart, was sie zugleich trennt. Es liegt am scheidenden Wesen der Grenze selbst, dass dieses mit geheimnisvoller Notwendigkeit unverbrüchlich auch ein Verbindendes ist." And here my attempt of a proper translation, only an attempt. And I quote, "The border does indeed also function as negation, that is to say, as a distinction. But we must add to this, as a distinction that unites everywhere at the same time. The boundary that separates the realms is also the boundary common to both. The borders function by holding together, linking and adjoining what separates them at the same time. It is due to the divisive nature of the border itself that it is, with mysterious necessity, also an unassailable unifying factor." End of quote. Dr. Quaiser from the Academy and I wish you a very successful conference here in our Academy, dealing with this important subject of borders in Southeast Europe. We are very glad that you are here, and we hope that you enjoy not only the conference, but also your stay here in Tutzing. Thank you very much.
Ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues and friends, many thanks to Professor Münch, Dr. Quaiser, and the Academy for their readiness to once again serving as a cooperation partner and host of this 58th International University Week. Thanks for the welcome and for the warm hospitality we enjoy once more in this beautiful and prestigious venue. My gratitude goes also to our academic conveners, Professor Christoph Neumann and Dr. Laut Bakas, for establishing an excellent program, and to those who have organized the event. Besides our executives, Dr. Brey and Dr. Hagemann, a special thanks goes to Victoria Shomoji, who stepped into the organization in a difficult time when the SOG Secretariat has heavily affected by sick leave. A warm welcome to all participants who arrived here, many of them after a long travel. A special welcome to the special guests of this opening event, in particular, members of our association and representatives from the Consular Corps in Munich. Let me now say a few words about the Southeast Europe Association, which has its headquarters in Munich and of which I have been president for the past 19 years. The association was founded in 1952 and is one of the largest academic and networking organizations in Germany. We have around 700 members. Most of them have an academic background. We deal with 16 countries in Southeast Europe by organizing international conferences, symposiums, and workshops, and offering seminars, lectures, and study trips. We have 20 branches in German university towns with their own local programs. Our networking service focuses on contacts between civil society organizations and stakeholders with policymakers, particularly in conflict situations. We also do a great deal to support students and young academics in the field of Southeast Europe. Our flagship in this area is the annual International University Week in Tutzing. Our aim is to establish long-term networks between young academics from Germany and all 16 of our partner countries. The internationally renowned journal Südosteuropa-Mitteilung is a highlight of our wide-ranging publishing activities. The Shaping the Future workshops have become a fixture in our schedule. At these events, selected representatives of civil society, politics, media, and think tanks discuss current developments in one of our partners' countries under the strict regime of the Chatham House rules and thus in a safe environment. I'm very happy that this year's International University Week has chosen not only a very timely topic, but also one that needs particular critical attention. borders have become a ubiquitous issue in recent years. On the one hand, the changing of borders returned as an issue on the European agenda at the beginning of this year, when Serbia and Kosovo discussed a land swap. Despite of being framed as an attempt to solve the standoff between the two countries, most observers feared that this idea had the potential to stir renewed conflict in the region and even to reopen discussions in other countries that were long deemed finished. On the other hand, beyond the changing of borders, their strengthening or weakening in the face of rising migration from the global south, depending on which political camp is asked, dominated the political agenda both in the European Union as well as in the United States in 2019. While the policies of Donald Trump and Matteo Salvini exemplified an approach that borders can simply be closed without tackling the roots of migration or consulting with other countries, the recent surge of migrants to Greece from Turkey and the ongoing suffering on the Balkan route exemplify that the question of how borders can function in a humane and still regulating way has not yet been solved. Overall, Germans have their own experiences with borders and are established able to relate to the suffering stemming from closed borders separating families and friends. It is thus an interesting coincidence that the International University Week focuses on the question of borders in the year when we celebrate the 30th anniversary of the fall of the Berlin Wall. This event should remind us of the idea of European borders that helped in so many cases to reduce ethnic conflict and to allow for peaceful cohabitation of long-time enemies. This reminder is not only timely when it comes to the developments of the gates of the EU in Serbia and Kosovo, but also in the old member states where Brexit comes with the danger of a hard border in Ireland. Borders are a ubiquitous issue, and the ideas and imaginations they stir are also strongly related to people's experiences and national narratives. I am thus especially happy that also this year the International University Week has gathered young scholars and senior experts from 20 countries who can share their perspectives on this issue. Our participants come this year from Albania, Austria, Belgium, Bosnia and Herzegovina, Bulgaria, France, Greece, Germany, Ireland, Italy, Kosovo, Lebanon, North Macedonia, the Netherlands, Poland, Sweden, Switzerland, Turkey, and the United States. They have different disciplinary backgrounds from both social sciences and the humanities, but they all share a conviction for the value of debate and the importance of the argument. I am thus looking forward to a week of interesting debates and thought-provoking presentations that will not only help to improve our academic work and sharpen your analysis, but that will also contribute to mutual understanding by looking at common topics through different national, disciplinary, or also historical lenses. I thus wish you all a week full of interesting experiences and encounters, and now I look forward to the introduction of our academic conveners and Professor Blumi's keynote. Before ending with this address, let me switch for a moment into German language for a personal address to Mrs. Gudrun Kuhlmann, whose employment as the Secretary of the SOG will terminate at the end of October this year. Liebe Frau Kuhlmann, Sie sind Anfang 1988 nach einem Studium und einem Masterabschluss in Germanistik und diversen Lektoratstätigkeiten in Verlagen als Angestellte im Bürodienst in den Dienst der SOG getreten. Nach mehr als 31 Jahren werden Sie zum 31. Oktober 2019 Ihre Tätigkeit beenden und in den Ruhestand treten. Als Präsident der Südosteuropa-Gesellschaft danke ich Ihnen auch im Namen des Präsidiums und der Mitglieder für Ihren unermüdlichen Einsatz in der Position als sozusagen Chefsekretärin der Gesellschaft. Bei der oft massiven Arbeitsbelastung in der Südosteuropa-Gesellschaft waren Sie immer eine zuverlässige, umsichtige und hochkompetente Stütze unserer Arbeit, die auch in turbulenten Zeiten den Überblick bewahrt hat. Ich nutze die Gelegenheit, mich für die vielen Jahre Ihres großen und erfolgreichen Einsatzes zu bedanken und Ihnen alles Gute für den wohlverdienten Ruhestand zu wünschen. Vor allen Dingen eine gute Gesundheit, einschließlich einer guten Genesung Ihres ledierten Armes. Ganz persönlich wollte ich noch sagen, ich habe mich immer gefreut, wenn ich Ihre Stimme am Telefon in der Wiedenmeyer Straße gehört habe. Nicht nur, weil Sie immer freundlich waren mit Ihren Antworten, sondern auch, weil ich wusste, dass Sie die Sachen, die wir besprochen haben, dann auch prompt erledigt haben. Sie haben sich wirklich verdient gemacht für die Südosteuropa-Gesellschaft. Wir alle wünschen Ihnen einen guten Übergang in eine neue Phase des Lebens und sind sehr, sehr respektvoll und dankbar für das, was Sie für uns alle geleistet haben. Herzlichen Dank.
Thank you, Christoph Neumann. My goodness. I like the segue from Oktoberfest to presenting who I am. That does not in any ways represent what he thinks of me or how he knows me, I'm sure. I'm a much more serious man than that, as you can hear from his presentation. But it's nice to be back seeing him. We had a wonderful time beginning of last year to set up a conference that tried to explore in many ways legacies of empire. That certainly borderland dynamics played a part of it. Whether or not that will actually end up in an edited volume, we're still looking into that. But that's something that I would like to follow up on perhaps a little bit here today. As Dr. Neumann has suggested, I move about and deal with very different geographies, but the themes seem to continuously be reinforced by questions that I've been asking as a graduate student already, and questions that afflicted me personally during the events of the 1990s, the late 1990s in particular. And in fact, I had at one point, 2001, I believe, spent a seminar just like you here with such an organized setting. I can't quite remember the theme of it, but no doubt it had to do with the violence in the Balkans and the ongoing concerns about how we're going to delineate and differentiate and separate combatants, both past, present, and potentially future. So I would like to use this time, I'm assuming I have some 45 minutes to 50 minutes to discuss the theme of border. One that's obviously an enduring problem in which Europe's history and indeed the global story is very much informed by how geographies are articulated by a cartographic language. A language that also, however, is very much a language of exchange in ways that are not necessarily ultimately resulting in the final border that we often study, or we actually put down in form of a map in the text that we publish, writing about certain conflicted areas. I'm suggesting that if we revisit the late 19th century, the process in which the borders of newly created states after the Berlin Congress were in the constant process of negotiation, renegotiation, that is something quite obvious with the constant redrawing, if you will, of the boundaries, something that I've written quite a bit about, and some of you in this room have as well. But my pursuit now of a new way, a new angle of studying the border and how it historically can help and inform and shape our language and approach to dealing with contemporary border debates about borders or conflicts over borders is to remind us again and again that there are people whose lives are directly affected by it. Anthropologists in particular, but as Peter Salins also was one of the founders as an historian, with a multidisciplinary kind of approach regarding the boundaries between Spain and France, there is this phenomenon in which peoples who live along and straddle borders, what we would call the phenomenon of borderlands, has actually been an important subfield of study, initiated by those who are looking at Latin America, the frontiers between the expanding US states and Mexico and the Comanche Empire of the 19th century. And in fact, contemporaries of that very process that helped inform borderland studies, contemporaries of the middle to late last quarter of the 19th century, of those Comanches, of those Spanish and European migrants who clashed in this environmentally rich region of Southwest United States and Mexico, Texas and California, were those of the Southeastern Europe in the Balkans. And I always highlight this to my students, that it's quite a remarkable story that, and with such a rich material for comparison, which I still find very frustrating that we are not doing that enough, looking at comparable cases and dynamics that have very different results often. But that's all for the better for us as students of borders and conflicts around borders. Be you a political scientist, an anthropologist, or historian, or a combination of all. It behooves you to actually explore other cases outside of your area of interest. So, learning from this borderland studies, someone who has engaged in this kind of comparative research in the past, and I'm on an ongoing project today, in fact, working with colleagues at Stanford University and SMU in Texas. We are working on a theme that is becoming increasingly important and of interest to a number of different disciplines, subdisciplines, and that's the environment. So I wish to present to you here a little bit of a taste of what I'm exploring now with Southeast Europe, especially Western Balkans, as one of my case studies. I'm looking at areas around the Red Sea, the Persian Gulf, and the Americas as other comparisons. But I will leave it, considering the theme of this week-long conference, the Southeast Europe, Western Balkans. The frontiers are what would constitute, and still remains, one of renegotiation, as we know from last year. The borders between what is and what is not Kosovo, Albania, and Montenegro. And I hope that this will, in many ways, understanding the kinds of conflicts and the adjustments that people are making, and especially the characters who are introduced to this contested space, those who have been uprooted from elsewhere and are expected to serve certain kind of demographic, political, economic, cultural purposes as migrants, as refugees, as settlers to these now contested areas. And more importantly, the valuation of the nature of this very, very rich and interesting area will be the theme, and that I encourage you will be something that hopefully can inspire you to take on new research topics in the future. For the last century and a half, associates of finance capitalism have sought to regulate the economic productivity of historically elusive peoples. In the past, I have sought to explore the documented fringes of failed polities in conflict with this expansive capitalist regime. In these studies, I hope to upset the process in which the meta-narratives of history somehow place and assert a certain way of studying border disputes, settlement around boundaries, and subsequent diplomatic negotiations over what to do after these borders have been set. I aim today to eliminate a few contingent factors that contributed to new relations between human communities within the confines of borderlines that proved entirely malleable, meaning shifting, breakable, reformed, to shifting conditions of imperial transition, a period of transition in which was an ongoing process. It was not a predetermined one. It was not one that, for the peoples involved in this process, did not know what the final results would be, and this is crucial for us as historians. We did not know where this was going in 1878, 1879, 1880, 81. There was no working model, in fact. This was a germinating, ongoing laboratory of a history that was yet to be written. In part, I am speaking about the commodification of nature, as it impacts how lands turning into borderlands take on conflicting importance. In a critical period after 1878, the Western Balkans became ideal zones of contention for numerous layerings, if you will, of human organization, be they states, be they corporations, be they small clusters of communities. In the critical period of the 1878, depending on the scale of analysis, the inflictions of the consequences of imperial bankruptcy, which indeed the Ottoman Empire had been at this time declared itself bankrupt and stopped paying its debts to mostly French, Belgian, and British banks at the time, differed greatly in these regions. So the consequences of this process, the context of bankruptcy, the war between Russia, somewhat on the stealth, the Habsburg Empire, and the Ottomans in these contested zones became, in part, an ongoing negotiation between very, very different actors who are often not present in the way we write about this period. More, it was the imposition of various measures of authority, delineated as boundaries sometimes, that many indigenous peoples could never accept, that conflicts over nature and how it would be used along these borderlands were most pronounced. In these parts of the Balkans, we would observe for decades an especially inconsistent intersection of capacities versus necessities among locals. At the time, the larger region was in the middle of a dramatic shift in global importance, impacting Belgian, German, Italian, maybe Luxembourg companies, considering my colleague there in the back, as much as those indigenous interlocutors compelled to accommodate or resist alike. In the frame of this growing interface between what would be imperialist projects to settle disputes over the region, I want to take us through some interesting examples of how conflicted and changing metrics of value toward water sources, firewood, fisheries, grazing lands, forests, and even trails animated this world. More crucially, conflicts over how to value the lands in question informed the frequent adaptations of the borderland economies in question. More crucially still, these exchanges proved entirely forgotten as new events shaped subsequent historical analysis, meaning we have not really had, they have not left an imprint in the historiography, and yet they were foundational to what happened subsequently. That these events, the personalities, the polities discussed there, failed to survive post-Ottoman and Habsburg history cannot determine how we scholars approach the borderlands of Southeast Europe. And this is, I think, an ethical issue for us to actually engage and appreciate, for these kinds of dynamics are at play today. They are actors on the ground yesterday, today, and tomorrow who will most likely never be registered on record, but they will have contributed greatly to how these border disputes will be ultimately resolved or perpetuated. In fact, it is these overshadowed tensions over how these lands were affected by borders that ultimately inform the ways we today lose sight of lessons otherwise misinterpreted by anachronistic uses of ethno-national terminologies. So I don't know if anyone here is actually involved in processes of negotiation or writing policy papers and advising individuals who will have considerable responsibility in the forthcoming disputes in Southeast Europe, let alone the larger world, Syria, Yemen, Iraq, Saudi Arabia, countries that I'm currently engaged in. Most likely their topographies, their geographies, their maps will be changing dramatically in the next couple of years. And that will certainly have an impact on us here in Europe. We go back to studying perceptions of these events by investing in identifying threads of agent activists from the shadows, hidden but nevertheless playing foundational roles in the development of border regimes after 1878. I will primarily discuss today how uprooted peoples faced a conflictual relationship with local peoples inhabiting lands targeted for both boundary delineation and resettlement for long-term security reasons. Crucially, the arrival of these refugees, migrants with state support led to a new economy of exploitation. The clashing needs of locals versus those refugees they hosted confused the subsequent valuation of forest, pasture land, streams, and offshore fisheries, and therefore also animated the discussions, the debates, and struggles over borders. As different constituencies valued the lands under contest differently, conflict that ensued exposes how borders were instrumentalized to often blur as much as impose conflicted sovereignties. Adopting a critical investigation of the last century of border controls and the management of newly strategic natural resources found along them ultimately upsets, I argue, fixed methods of analyzing the world and warns of the need to be more careful with border issues today. It is the readjustments of power in the Balkans after the Russo-Ottoman War of 1877-78 that offers us insights into the underlying tensions with boundaries at moments of instability and precarity. In framing the context of negotiating borders as a means of resolving and imposing at the same time new claims to authority and thus new measures of valuation of the resources found in these borderland areas, I am situating contentious politics as inspired by Charles Tilly, my old professor at the New School, within a new range of researchable methods of empire that I would suggest that hopefully some of you will embrace at some point. The regions of interest here prove that imperial state authority throughout the critical 1880s to 1920 period were precarious at best. The periodization is telling in that it mirrors events throughout the world, as I mentioned already, in which industrial scale projects required enormous and often not so enormous or modest foreign capital investment, along with huge amounts of pliable, cheap labor. The resulting intersection of these economic needs led in much of the Balkans to the kinds of interactions deemed crucial to forming the policies associated with modern state-building narratives. Considering the roads, the bridges, the railroads, the port lands, all the things that will come subsequently to the agreement to delineate and divide up Ottoman Balkans after 1878 is a point that I wish to highlight that has valuable comparative possibilities. That these regions prove marginal to subsequent national historiographies ultimately helps make an ongoing methodological point. Namely, we are dealing with distortions of importance by the fact ignored regions or gaps of analysis necessarily erase contributions to the modern story of capitalist imperialism in general. What's happening in the Western Balkans at this time is part of the larger global story of capitalism. Failing to see these primary animating forces of interest clashing with people affected by borders leads to failed policies of conflict resolution that inevitably follow. In other words, events in forgotten spaces seemingly of little importance to global storylines miss out on the considerable tensions arising from modest, subtle daily interactions between agents of capitalism and indigenous interlocutors. Again, we as active participants in this process of talking about borders, maybe even influencing the negotiations over borders, need to be sensitive to a number of people who are otherwise discarded, dismissed, ignored. It is their lives who are affected by these borders, and it's they who, in response to these affections, will ultimately decide if your interventions are going to succeed or fail. At the heart of these dynamic moments, at the fringes of history, are those human interactions with nature, quintessential concerns of any settlement process. Procuring resources for simple survival, no matter how modest the alien settler population may have been, often leaves imprints of greater imperialist operations difficult to decipher otherwise. So we need to start also thinking about the logistics of providing for those found on borderlands. That, I think, has an interesting way for us to open up new kinds of questions when we do research on these topics. I am advocating using archival research to discover how various subaltern, refugee, migrant constituencies and their burdened host communities identified a pragmatic need to manipulate competing imperial claims to survive the winter. We have every season new waves of migrants who are sometimes finding themselves in conditions in which they are not cared for. They will find ways to survive. If they don't, then that's another thing. But the resulting conflicts, especially for those who are expected to host them, I think is an important animating force for us to keep in mind. To appreciate the intimacies created by conflict over borderlands and the increased interest in the wealth of these regions' nature, we can also adopt both macro and intimately micro scales of analysis in order to get at what's actually going on. The arrival of refugees to these areas was the critical force of consequence. At the heart of the conflict that followed their arrival was procuring supplies to care for their long-term settlement. Securing off-season animal feed proved vital to longer-term influence for those who still claimed authority over entire ecosystems now found along resettlement campaigns. These once inaccessible constituencies were now facing invasion and subsequent loss of their nature. Their responses are critical for us today. How did they respond to the fact that now they would have to bear the burden of hosting refugees from elsewhere? Newfound opportunities to influence movements of herds, thus human communities who follow these herds, I'm talking about animals now, herds of animals, of sheep, of other grazing animals, accompanied the negotiations over the redirection of resources once seasonally accessed for only local consumption and their use to trade and make income in periods of surplus. As these valued products of local nature gained new value to those inhabiting neighboring valleys or ports, the struggle over rights and power of the modern state become obvious. The sudden shifts in value of local production changed the personal lives as well as commercial fortunes of those living on the ground and opened up entire new horizons for action by state authorities who, in the case of these regions, were non-existent prior to this period. The subsequent tales of opportunistic investment often profited while upsetting local supply chains. So profiting from the upsetting of local communities is a dangerous dynamic that is often disconnected in the narrative of these borderland stories. The reorientating logistics of provisioning new kinds of imperial subjects along now imposed borders would never accommodate the diplomatic negotiations taking place in faraway Berlin. So while diplomats were negotiating, there were other dynamics going on the ground. And the disconnect often meant going back to Berlin and renegotiating these boundaries. As different polities found along borderlands in a negotiation competed with each other over revalued natural resources, we note the limits of traditional methods of conflict analysis and resolution. In the Balkans, local and regional economies adapted, with the particular tension around illegal exploitation of resources increasingly coveted by formal agents of state expected to manage these resources or these regions. So behaviors that were once day-to-day ones suddenly become policed and often become criminalized. That had a dramatic consequence on the relationship between borderlands, and the peoples who were expected to live there. As the natural assets of once isolated, autonomously governed homelands became zones of settlement of outsiders, the forests, pastures, and lakes of people become framed administratively as state assets that acquire new value. Similarly, state officials who negotiate ways to repay debts start allocating these same assets to private interests, often very, very foreign, capitalist ones. Such valuations or revaluations, reflecting calculations rarely explicit in any of the documents we use to study these border conflicts, means the traditional practices of the local indigenous populations become targets for regulation, kind of an unfair exchange. The force, the imposition and the demand to change and transform is put on those people who are the most vulnerable and the ones who are most victimized by this process. The resulting, often violent struggle to protect their respective claims to their nature on newly declared strategic lands has broad range of consequences, only complicated further with the arrival again of these refugees that come in waves in this part of the region. It's not only the 1860s, 1870s. They come again and again up into the Balkan Wars. To fully capture the significant transitional period that is still conflated with broader abstract notions of reform and modernity in the context of these empires, or the subsequent states that would be created out of them, we focus on a narrow region that today remains volatile as indigenous peoples and waves of migrants over the 20th century have adjusted anew to larger regional and global forces. Command over the resources that sustain unmodern economies meant living with ecologies in very different ways than would be expected, with the Malesi suddenly becoming of global importance from 1878 onwards. This once forgotten region turned valuable, both for the diplomatic struggle, but also for Ottoman, Montenegrin, Habsburg state regulators who were commanded to settle the region and exploit its natures. Again, the forest valleys and plains of Malsor country suddenly took on new diplomatic and commercial value. Authority over the disparate natives who were still trying to struggle to maintain some kind of control over these natural resources meant remaking their identities, formerly as legal subjects of not local authorities, but those of sovereigns compelled to surrender their nature to the market as per new treaties. New debts, new regimes of borrowing led to new kinds of conflicts, and this would be a persistent one, which would force those who were facing to have to forced to surrender these assets. Their dynamism of this exchange ultimately impacted how they identified themselves. There may be a useful way, therefore, to rethink the parallel drive of rationalizing the Balkans in this period and how conflicts today begin and end. By settlement, numeration, objectification of the new tools of empire, locals would be forced to yield to demands of global capitalism. In their settlement, by way of treaty, they would be subordinate to the market, pay taxes, and surrender their nature to alien sovereignties with very little or no compensation. This corresponded at times with equally disparate and violent moments of actualizing the theory of nature's usefulness, no longer as a common resource of spiritual sanctuary, but of fiscal balance for authorities in Istanbul or somewhere else in some other capital in the Balkans. Pushing to make nature productive meant those travelers, as ethnographers, adventurers, and diplomats interacting with these natives, made them activists as well. They became the observers of this process and actually started to become, in many ways, the resource for subsequent efforts to settle these border conflicts. And you see these kinds of let's say, itinerant diplomats still today, right? You still, whether they take the form of journalists who write big, thick volumes about peoples of this region, or they end up working for some think tank. This dynamic as well has an interesting imprint on the story of borders, which I can get into later if you want in Q&A, if such a thing will be possible. At times, clashing uses of nature read as different claims of sovereignty. And this would often be overshadowed, however, by our later need to understand change in these regions as products of sectarian wars and nationalist projects or nation-building projects. As such, it may be fruitful to let these local contexts speak to us without subordinating them to the social science methodologies or entrenched historiographies that have been subsequently dominant in how we tell these stories. Indeed, that as the natural assets of these regions are framed administratively in the documents I'm reading as state assets, they acquire new value, largely mediated by market forces. And therefore, the traditional practices of the local indigenous populations become targets for new kinds of regulation and policing. It opens up entirely new disciplines of policing and enforcing state authority. Many of our anthropologists, social scientists whose traditions are drawn from this very kind of moment, this ideal moment of becoming now activist partners in this process of studying and advocating how to control the nature of these local peoples. The fight for what the refugees that I'm referring to as well, sometimes coming in, the settlers expected to gain from their new homes, meant another set of calculations that were not personal, but became increasingly framed as rational. This ongoing availability of freelancing agents of capital, who became intermediaries of, for instance, lumber and mineral companies amid these shifting settlements, provided other lines of credit that would become important for us to study, because they were the ones who would leave the imprint in documents. They were the ones who left a paper trail behind. But we should not be subordinate to how they framed these interactions, the borderland dynamics here. Attempts to address the serious issues of hundreds of thousands of displaced peoples unintentionally imposed a bond between the governed and regimes of nature management. Such alliances of necessity were strategic and came at the expense of indigenous polities sometimes, sometimes not so. Considering such cases, it is clear that the central concern for the hundreds of thousands of involuntary migrants and their hosts was to ensure that confiscated lands would be redistributed to the right people, a process in which the entirely contingent politics of local state relations becomes clear moving forward. If we consider for now the violence in Kosovo, Manastir, and Ishkoder between 1878 and 1881, a critical period in Albanian historiographic mythology, but if we think of it not as an Albanian struggle, but one between mobilized refugees and local hosts, we immediately appreciate the subsequent years of interactions in these same areas better. I suggest that land and the nature out of what it came was a mechanism by which prominent locals and government officials could influence both refugees and locals within the lines of newly marked borders. So that's kind of a research theme, if you will. While refugee communities, especially refugee communities, may have been the beneficiaries of policies that hoped to secure stability in the region by putting them in large numbers along newly created borders, there is evidence to suggest that state officials also saw them as potential loyal agents who could help implement many of the government centralization reforms that were still received hostilely in other parts of the empire. So borderlands in the Balkans became laboratories, if you will, for subsequent regimes of governing this disparate empire. In this respect, the immigration of hundreds of thousands of people provided the Hamidian state with an opportunity to expand the reach of the state into previously inaccessible and hostile, but now strategic frontier regions, both in these areas that we're talking about, but again, as working models, as experience. Many of these officials would then go on elsewhere, be it in Yemen, be it in Kuwait, be it in Libya. Indeed, and this is something very interesting to consider, the OSCE creature that comes and services and becomes the expert of border conflicts resolutions, or UN officials. They basically are imploded in different parts of the world. Their way of understanding the boundaries are thus reflective of their previous experiences, but is it necessarily one reflective of the conditions that they are facing at that moment? Indeed, Indeed, the ability of the state to redistribute land wealth in Kosovo and Ishkoder to those newly arrived constituents required the cooperation of large numbers of borderland inhabitants, new or old, a requirement not lost on community leaders representing the interests of both locals and refugees being slowly marginalized by the subsequent adaptations. As a result, there are many instances when refugee community leaders directly allied with government officials at the expense of working with their indigenous host communities. And if you're curious, they're in fact what we would call today ethnic Albanians on both sides of this divide. So you had clashes between people who in theory, at least in historiography, are supposedly sharing a common agenda at this stage, where clearly that's not the case. The struggle over distributing land and the exploitation of nature was one that was internecine. Only internecine, however, if we accept the narrative of post-Ottoman historiography. The resulting scramble for leverage against these encroachments on local interests led many to seek out new patrons, which often generated the kind of opportunity competing great powers required to gain a foothold in what had previously been inaccessible areas deep in the Ottoman Balkans. So Italians, Habsburg authorities, and even newly created states like Serbia and Romania also gained now new access, new influence. For instance, prominent members of the refugees from Podgorica, such as Hassan Bey, Mustafa and Ibrahim, openly lobbied government authorities based in Škoder to compensate for their financial losses as a result of their expulsion from newly created Montenegro. Part of that compensation included the redistribution of valuable land all along the frontier with the newly created Montenegro that had once belonged to other local farming Albanian communities. Facing such a disruption in their lives, these involuntary host communities, having to sacrifice much of their valuable land to these refugees, who secured considerable power as a result, ignited a period of confrontation that is not registered in subsequent generations of nationalist historiography. In time, this left them vulnerable to future mobilization by Montenegro or various factions within the larger Catholic Church universe. And this often led to conflicts between those who were supported by Italy or the Austrian-Hungarian Empire, a factor that is especially important in the period leading up to the Balkan Wars of 1912, when there would actually be a new regime of border drawing that ultimately would lead to a very contested creation of an Albanian state of some form. All this is intricately linked to a constant reordering of the state bureaucracy that was expected to manage these complicated zones of awkwardness, using the language of anthropologist Anne Tsing. One measure was the decision to transform the districts under particular threat by redrawing the internal administrative boundaries that redistributed local state power and hoped to dilute some of the power of disruptive local coalitions to further afield. So the internal boundaries of the Ottoman administration itself is transforming. It's not just boundaries between competing sovereign states, but we should also think about the consequences this has on internal states, delineation of authority. An example of this was the consolidation of the districts of Mat, Mirdita, and Škodra. The responsibility of administrating this newly consolidated mega region was given to Dervish Pasha, based in Škodra. The new administration did not waste much time in completely restructuring the way in which local economies were organized and how local resources would be exploited. In each of the sub-districts, Dervish Pasha negotiated and then implemented the distribution of land to certain kinds of refugees, especially those from just on the other side of the border in Montenegro. This ostensibly settled these refugees and immediately made them constituents to a state that was proactively trying to encourage infringements on these, again, settled borders that were still highly disputed by these strategically located refugees just on the other side of what used to be their homeland. The problem again was that locals who used this land previously were now they lost out in this process. The ensuing violent protest actually forced the state to issue yet another set of laws that both empowered it in new ways to confiscate and redistribute people's land even more aggressively, and generalize a compensation plan, just in case victims of this land grab started to collaborate amongst themselves. So there was now, throughout the reports, now concerned that they are actually now exchanging notes, and they begin to realize they can't trust any kinds of promises established in these negotiated redrawing of borders and distribution of resources. This means that often the state was compelled to use one community's resources to placate another's rebellion, a policy that created the conditions after 1878 for an endless spiral of violence, disgruntlement, and instability in some of these areas. Now, today's scholars fixated on finding the roots of post-Ottoman nation in the violence revealed here often assert this was a result of ethno-national tensions between rival ethnic groups or religious groups, in many cases. We should resist the temptation to reduce complicated, diverse, and ever-shifting conflicts like these between many different stakeholders to be simply a product of primordial ethnic animosities. Instead, appreciating how these reforms were justified in the face of local opposition helps better understand the long-term consequences that imperial frontiers had on the fragmented local polity and the range of possibilities available to many different stakeholders involved. In the Western Balkans, we would observe for decades from the 1870s onwards an especially inconsistent intersection of capacities versus necessities in respect to local, regional, and global perceptions of nature's value. The larger region at this time would be in the middle of a dramatic shift in global importance, impacting outsiders from Swiss, Danish, Italian, German companies, as well as those indigenous potential interlocutors willing to accommodate or resist alike. In the frame of this growing interface between what would be imperialist projects with the immediate give and take of a smaller historic scale, I want to take us through some interesting examples, or I took us through some examples of how conflicted and changing metrics of value toward often modest resources like fresh water, simple things like this that sustain a community or does not, animated the world large and small. So it was indeed critical that the resulting attempts of settled refugees and the administrations built around the enclaves came with corresponding infrastructure development and economic inducements for the new arrivals to stay and fight for their newly granted lands. It animated new movements as a result. And crucially for this region, you begin to see cities becoming new points of exchange for many of those who once cherished lands of isolation were now suddenly forced to be engaged and were part of international conflict. In other words, events in forgotten spaces of seemingly little importance to the scramble for Africa, the great game, or variations of these global storylines miss out on the considerable operational tensions arising from modest, subtle daily interactions between forgotten agents of capitalism and indigenous ones resisting the infringements of this juggernaut. The nevertheless crucial immediate concerns of seemingly backwater compounds that in times of frenzy like the California gold rush or the diamond boom in southern Africa can turn modest peripheral enclaves of settlement into furnaces of political intrigue, commercial opportunity, and violent competition. At the heart of these dynamic moments at the fringes of history prove with a new interest in human interactions with nature that I'm again proposing as a way moving forward to understanding borders and borderlands prove to be quintessential concerns of any settlement in subsequent conflicted moments. And that, again, you see that throughout the world. Struggles over diamond mines and gold mines throughout Africa, forests that include the forest of this region where Esad Pasha is emerging, are interesting, gives us interesting insights into this dynamic, this interrelation between nature, the environment, and the borderland phenomenon. I thus advocate appreciating the intimacies created by shape-shifting indigenous and foreign actors in conflict over borderlands and the wealth of these regions' nature. These tales of opportunistic investment in upsetting supply chains, reorienting logistics of provisioning outposts with relatively small human resources demanded that great powers negotiate with local regional inhabitants who had often entirely different metrics to value that nature. And those became ultimately opportunities for the likes of these men here. The map as a modern tool of state is accepted. Its function as a tool of delineation no longer challenged. By the Berlin Congresses, any ambiguity could lead to war between polities that have conflicted claims of sovereignty over territories and their inhabitants. The map, therefore, served a particular function in an expansive period of Western imperialism. Marked as lines on the map, institutions and actors are assumed to normalize and naturalize a spatial order between these lines. But however, this process was very much contingent to often unrelated historical forces that sometimes have even been forgotten. This is certainly the case when inspecting many late 19th century maps from a 21st century perspective. The apparent lack of precision and almost haphazard and arbitrary sweep across vaguely defined swaths of land is disconcerting. And one can almost, again, with the benefit of hindsight, to say, no kidding that conflicts arose from how these boundaries were delineated and imposed. Any number of borderland studies help us explore the larger issues of modernity's totalitarian quest through the map. William Zartman, for instance, recognized the border as a social process that is constantly shifting with the ebbs and flows of human life along these borderlands. In line with the larger state building measures so often highlighted in the literature around these borders, the demands for tightening control over what was deemed to be too porous of boundaries, both to raise revenue by taxing cross-border trade and assuring that goods and services did not enter or exit without formal oversight, meant conflict was inevitable. On paper, these policies correspond well with how political scientists study state centralization projects over the long term. Events in the Balkans certainly began to take on a more conventional modern border typology. I'm most likely going to be reporting on this. But there is a danger in attributing too much conventional significance to the existence of these borders as markers of one state's sovereignty and a denial of another state's claims to this area. As similar mechanisms of harnessing the regional economies were to make inroads throughout the Balkans throughout the 20th century, only to be condemned and violently suppressed later on, labeling in frames of legality and as a consequence embracing what others are justifying as acts of state imposition of order, shuts out the possibility of resistance. Resistance becomes criminal. It becomes a part of a lexicon of denying people rights of reacting to these dynamics that clearly affected their lives. With the competing efforts to exploit nature, the resulting environmental shifts, with droughts to changing migratory patterns of semi-wild herds to the process of avoiding larger human settlements, there appears to have been a number of contributions from people directly or so dramatically affected by this process that have been left out of history. In this aspect, there may be a new way to study the otherwise straightforward struggle to define ways to exploit nature along borderlands. The discovered debates around what constitutes the natural versus the human utility of such assets, like forests, may provide a new appreciation for the depth of environmental history, borderland studies, state formation, and its possibilities to contribute to the study of the late Ottoman Empire and contemporary Balkans. As such, this lecture sought to study conflict over a new range of strategic concerns in far too often neglected comparative pairings. As waves of mobile imperial subjects settle in territories either unknown or later recently marked as new borderlands separating once unified lands, contestation over what constituted local communal resources and who had a right to profit from them becomes evident in discussions and documents over nature. Forests in the hinterlands increasingly valued as sources of revenue for cash-strapped imperial authorities or newly independent states borrowing money from the IMF means that the lands now take on a new dynamic, and those people who are expected to leave these lands in order to avail the state to plunder them or allow corporations to plunder them. Now, of course, I'm speaking of the post-1990s Balkans, means that these dynamics will remain central to our 21st century Balkans. As you begin your conference and explore aspects of conflicted claims, consider the enduring precarity of order and that contingencies always upset even the most monitored borderland regime in place. Anything you study in theory, anything that's that makes its way up to the foreign ministry's level is subject to change. The resulting adjustments and opportunities unleash new trajectories impossible to predict and are only useful retrospectively when much destruction follows, unfortunately. If our goal is to avoid the consequences of misreading human possibilities like these, we need to learn to read between the lines of our border today. The story as left behind by 20th century nationalist historiographies are inadequate to understanding the relative level of transition this period represents. In the scholarship, the events seem to refer to wars, anti-imperialist battles with expulsions and floods of state-supported colonizations. The extent to which conflict over land and resources are thus framed in projects that likely take different iterations depending on the moment and fail to provide teleological support for the final product of a nation-state story is an important theoretical quest for us. It is a methodological requirement that we start to investigate in more complicated ways the consequences on those people who will inevitably be left out of the final story, what we call a negotiated border. So thank you very much. Do we field questions? I don't know. But